Hello, and welcome to the Rad Book Club. Today I've decided to do a reading here at the so-called Memorial to the Victims of Communism here in Ottawa. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism. This book was published by City Lights Books in 1997. But amazingly, it's still as relevant today as when it was published. Specifically, I think we have to ask ourselves, who were the victims of communism? Why is this memorial here? And are Canadians and the Canadian government allied with anti-communists? And who are anti-communists? I would argue anti-communists are fascists. But let's find out. We will do a little bit of reading in Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds, and we'll find out a little bit about the history of the victims of communism. And then we're going to go and we're going to find out a little bit about the victors of fascism. To it. We have heard much about the ruthless Reds, beginning with the reign of terror and repression perpetrated during the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, 1929 to 1953. Estimates of those who perished under Stalin's rule, based principally on speculations by writers who never reveal how they arrive at such figures, vary wildly. Thus, Roy Medvedev puts Stalin's victims at 5 to 7 million. Robert Conquest decided on 7 to 8 million. Olga Shatunovskaya claims 19.8 million just for the 1935 to 1940 period. Stephen Cohen says 9 million by 1939, with 3 million executed or dying from mistreatment during the 1936 to 39 period. And Arthur Koestler tells us it was 20 to 25 million. More recently, William Rusher of the Claremont Institute refers to the 100 million people wantonly murdered by communist dictators since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And Richard Lowry blames the Stalin era for the slaughter of millions. Unburdened by any documentation, these estimates invite us to conclude that the sum total of people incarcerated in the labor camps over a 22-year period, allowing for turnovers due to death and term expirations, would have constituted an astonishing portion of the Soviet population. The support and supervision of the Gulag, all the labor camps, labor colonies, and prisons of the Soviet system would have been the USSR's largest single enterprise. In the absence of reliable evidence, we are fed anecdotes, such as the story Winston Churchill tells of the time he asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. According to Churchill, the Soviet leader responded by raising both his hands, a gesture that may have signified an unwillingness to broach the subject. But since Stalin happened to have 5 fingers on each hand, Churchill concluded, without benefit of a clarifying follow-up question, that Stalin was confessing to 10 million victims. Would the head of state of one state, especially the secret of Stalin, casually proffer such an admission to the head of another state? To this day, Western writers treat this woolly tale as an ironclad confession of mass atrocities. What we do know of Stalin's purges is that many victims were Communist Party officials, managers, military officers, and other strategically situated individuals whom the dictator saw fit to incarcerate or liquidate. In addition, whole categories of people whom Stalin considered of unreliable loyalty, Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Germans, were selected for internal deportation. Though they never saw the inside of a labor camp or a prison, they were subjected to non-custodial resettlement in Central Asia and Siberia. To be sure, crimes of state were committed in communist countries, and many political prisoners were unjustly interred and even murdered. But the inflated numbers offered by Cold War scholars serve neither historical truth nor the cause of justice, but merely help to reinforce a knee-jerk fear and loathing of those terrible Reds. In 1993, for the first time, several historians gained access to previously secret Soviet police archives and were able to establish well-documented estimates of prison and labor camp populations. They found that the total population of the entire Gulag as of January 1939, near the end of the Great Purges, was 2,22,976. My apologies. At about that time, there began a purge of the purgers, including many intelligence and secret police, officials and members of the judiciary and other investigative committees, who were suddenly held responsible for the excesses of the terror despite their protestations of fidelity to the regime. Soviet labor camps were not death camps like those the Nazis built across Europe. There was no systematic extermination of inmates, no gas chambers or crematoria to dispose of millions of corpses. Despite harsh conditions, the great majority of Gulag inmates survived and eventually returned to society when granted amnesty or when their terms were finished. In any given year, 20 to 40% of the inmates were released, according to archive records. Oblivious to these facts, the Moscow correspondent of the New York Times in 1996 continued to describe the gulags as, quote, the largest system of death camps in modern history, unquote. Almost 1 million Gulag prisoners were released during World War II to serve in the military. The archives reveal that more than half of all Gulag deaths from the 1934 to 1953 period occurred during the war years, 1941 to 1945. Mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the common lot of the entire Soviet population. Some 22 million Soviet citizens perished in the war. In 1944, for instance, the labor camp death rate was 92 per 1,000. By 1953, with the post-war recovery, camp deaths had declined to 3 per 1,000. Should all Gulag inmates be considered innocent victims of Red repression? Contrary to what we have been led to believe, those arrested for political crimes, or counter-revolutionary offenses, so to speak, numbered from 12 to 33% of the prison population, varying from year to year. The vast majority of inmates were charged with non-political offenses: murder, assault, theft, banditry, smuggling, swindling, and other violations punishable in any society. Total executions from 1921 to 1953, a 33-year span inclusive, were 799,455. No breakdown of this figure was provided by the researchers. It includes those who were guilty of non-political capital crimes, as well as those who collaborated in the Western capitalist invasion and subsequent White Guard Army atrocities. It also includes some of the considerable numbers who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, and probably German SS prisoners. In any case, the killings of political opponents were not in the millions or tens of millions, which is not to say that the actual number was either inconsequential or justifiable. The three historians who studied the heretofore secret Gulag records concluded that the number of victims were far less than usually claimed in the West. This finding is ridiculed by anti-communist liberal Adam Hochschild, who prefers to repeat Churchill's story about Stalin's fingers. Like many others, Hochschild has no trouble accepting undocumented speculations about the gulags, but much more difficulty accepting the documented figures drawn from the secret police archives. As Michael Parenti makes clear in his book, and as I will echo as well, it's not to say that there weren't so-called victims of communism. Definitely, there were victims of Stalinism. There were victims of the system that was set up by Stalin and maintained by his successors. And there were real horrors that came out of that system in the countries that suffered under that system. But let's be clear, the political claims that made this monument happen are entirely based on anti-communism. And I would argue that anti-communism is fascism. Both wings of the political structure here in Canada, the red wing liberals and the blue wing conservatives, have spent millions of dollars and expended enormous amounts of political capital to get this structure built. And it is, to me, a monument about fascism. Because that's what anti-communism is. Now, there's a lot of claims made in this city about who Canada supports and what Canada stands for. And right down the street, there's another memorial that's very, very important to the political structure of this city and this country. And we're going to go down there next and have the next reading. And let's hear a little bit about fascism and the supposed countering of fascism that was done by Western countries after the Second World War. One of the things conveniently overlooked by mainstream writers is the way Western capitalist states, like Canada, have cooperated with fascism. In his collaborationist efforts, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was positively cozy with the Nazis. He and many of his class saw Hitler as a bulwark against communism in Germany, and Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism in Europe. It wasn't just Neville Chamberlain, it was Canada's political class as well. After World War II, the Western capitalist allies, such as Canada, did little to eradicate fascism from Germany or Italy, except for putting some of the top leaders on trial at Nuremberg. By 1947, German conservatives began to depict the Nuremberg prosecutors as dupes of the Jews and communists. In Italy, the strong partisan movement that had waged armed struggle against fascism was soon treated as suspect and unpatriotic. Within a year after the war, almost all Italian fascists were released from prison, while hundreds of communists and other leftist partisans who had been fighting the Nazi occupation were jailed. History was turned on its head, transforming the Blackshirts into victims and the Reds into criminals. Allied authorities, like Canada, assisted in these measures. Under the protection of U.S. occupation authorities, the police, courts, military, security agencies, and bureaucracy remained largely staffed by those who had served the former fascist regimes or by their ideological recruits, as is true to this day. The perpetrators of the Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews, 500,000 gypsies, thousands of homosexuals, several million Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, and others, and got away with it. in good part because the very people who were supposed to investigate these crimes were themselves complicit. In comparison, when the communists took over in East Germany, they removed some 80% of the judges, teachers, and officials for their Nazi collaboration. They imprisoned thousands, and they executed 600 Nazi party leaders for war crimes. They would have shot more of the war criminals had not so many fled to the protective embrace of the West. What happened to the US businesses that collaborated with fascism? The Rockefellers family's Chase National Bank used its Paris office in Vichy, France, to help launder German money to facilitate Nazi international trade during the war, and did so with complete impunity. Corporations like DuPont, Ford, General Motors, and ITT owned factories in enemy countries that produced fuel, tanks, and planes that wreaked havoc on Allied forces. After the war, instead of being prosecuted for treason, ITT collected $27 million from the US government for war damages inflicted on its German plants by Allied bombings. General Motors collected over $33 million. Pilots were given instructions not to hit factories in Germany that were owned by US firms. Thus, Cologne was almost leveled by Allied bombing, but its Ford plant, providing military equipment for the Nazi army, was untouched. Indeed, German civilians began using the plant as an air raid shelter. Hundreds of Nazi war criminals found a haven in the United States, either living in comfortable anonymity or actively employed by US intelligence agencies during the Cold War, and otherwise enjoying the protection of high-placed individuals. Some of them found their way onto the Republican presidential campaign committees of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush. And just in case we want to claim that we in Canada are better than the United States, we should remember that one of the most powerful Canadian politicians currently operating, someone who until recently was the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, is the granddaughter of a Ukrainian Nazi. Nazis have been celebrated inside Parliament Hill, inside the Parliament, inside the House of Commons. A Nazi flag was unfurled on Parliament Hill not too long ago. And of course, there are 900 Nazi war criminals who came to Canada and whose identities are still protected to this day by the Canadian government. Almost 1,000 German Nazis, some of them Ukrainian undoubtedly too, protected by Canada. Makes a mockery of the monument in which I'm standing. In Italy, from 1969 to 1974, high-ranking elements in the Italian military intelligence and civilian intelligence agencies, members of P2, a secret lodge of upper-class reactionaries, pro-fascist Vatican officials, and top military brass, and Gladio, a NATO-inspired anti-communist mercenary force, embarked upon a concerted campaign of terror and sabotage known as the Strategy of Tension. Other participants included a secret neo-fascist group called the Ordine Nuovo, NATO officials, members of the Carabinieri, mafia bosses, 30 generals, 8 admirals, and influential Freemasons, such as a fascist war criminal, Licio Gelli, who was recruited by US intelligence in 1944. The terrorism was aided and abetted by the international security apparatus, including the CIA. In 1995, the CIA refused to cooperate with an Italian parliamentary commission investigating the strategy of tension. Wonder why? The terrorist conspirators carried out a series of kidnappings, assassinations, and bombing massacres, including the explosion that killed 85 people and injured some 200, many seriously, in the Bologna train station in August 1980. As subsequent judicial investigations concluded, the strategy of tension was not a simple product of neo-fascism, but the consequence of a larger campaign conducted by state security forces against the growing popularity of the democratic parliamentary left. The objective was to combat by any means necessary the electoral gains of the Italian Communist Party and create enough fear and terror in the population so as to undermine the multi-party social democracy and replace it with an authoritarian presidential republic, or in any case, a stronger and more stable executive. In the 1980s, scores of people were murdered in Germany, Belgium, and elsewhere in Western Europe by extreme rightists in the service of state security agencies. These acts of terrorism went mostly unreported in the US corporate-owned media. As with the earlier strategy of tension in Italy, the attacks were designed to create enough popular fear and uncertainty so as to undermine the existing social democracies. Authorities in these Western European countries and the United States and Canada have done little to expose neo-Nazi networks. As the whiffs of fascism develop into an undeniable stench, we are reminded that Hitler's progeny are still with us and that they have dangerous links with each other and within the security agencies of various Western capitalist nations. In Italy, in 1994, the national elections were won by the National Alliance, a broadened version of the neo-fascist MSI, in coalition with a League of Northern Separatists and Forza Italia, a quasi-fascist movement headed by industrialist and media tycoon Silvio Berlusconi. The National Alliance played on resentments regarding unemployment, taxes, and immigration. It called for a single tax rate for rich and poor alike, school vouchers, and stripping away of the social benefits and the privatization of most services. The Italian neo-fascists were learning from the US reactionaries how to achieve fascism's class goals within the confines of quasi-democratic forms. Use an upbeat, Reagan-esque optimism. Replace the jackbooted militarists with media-hyped crowd pleasers. Convince people that government is the enemy, especially its social service sector, while strengthening the repressive capacities of the state. Instigate racist hostility and antagonisms between the resident population and immigrants. Preach the mythical virtues of the free market and pursue tax and spending measures that redistribute income upward. Kind of sounds familiar here in Canada. Conservatives in the Western nations utilize diluted forms of the fascist mass appeal. In the USA, they propagate populist-sounding appeals to the ordinary middle American, while quietly pressing for measures that serve the interests of the wealthiest individuals and corporations. In 1996, right-wing Speaker of the House of Representatives Newt Gingrich, while proffering a new rollback agenda that would supposedly revitalize all of society, announced, "I am a genuine revolutionary." Whether in Italy, Germany, the United States, or any other country, including Canada, when the right offers a new revolution or a new order, it is in the service of the same old moneyed interests. leading down that well-trodden road of reaction and repression that so many third world countries have been forced to take. The road those at the top want us all to travel. We have to ask ourselves, in a country like Canada, what road is that they want us to travel? And where does it lead to? To me, it leads to places like this. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more content like this, the questions, the mythologies told by our society, please subscribe. Ciao for now.